Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal just hours before the wedding that was meant to solidify his grip over Willow Tate's future, Drew Kane found himself spiraling into a state of dread he hadn't known since his darkest days. Willow was gone. Vanished. There were no messages, no clues left voluntarily, only chaos wrapped in silence. Her phone, the only thing she carried everywhere, had been abandoned on the floor of their bedroom. The delicate silk wedding dress she had once gazed at with hopeful eyes still hung untouched on its hanger. A subtle yet chilling draft from the closet door revealed faint claw-like scratches etched into the wooden floor, barely visible unless one looked closely, as if someone had been dragged or had fought to resist. On the vanity lay the torn remains of a bridal veil, the shredded lace flung across the mirror like a ghostly omen. And in that moment of paralyzed disbelief, Drew realized that this was no accident. This wasn't cold feet. Willow had been taken. And in the corners of his mind that he often ignored, two names began to echo with increasing certainty, Liesl Obrecht and Nina Reeves. For months, Drew had masked his controlling tendencies behind an expertly constructed facade of affection and stability. To the outside world, he was the supportive partner, the wounded soul who'd reassembled himself through love. But behind closed doors, his manipulation was constant, clinical. He presented himself as Willow's only emotional anchor, particularly after the death of her mother. He promised her protection, peace, even redemption, but only on his terms. Daily supplements that he claimed were to help her sleep turned out to be laced with low-dose sedatives. He had slowly isolated her from friends, from Scout, even from her own instincts. Willow's independence had been meticulously eroded. But someone had been watching, someone far more dangerous to Drew than he ever anticipated. Liesl, perceptive and shrewd to a fault, had noticed the shift in Willow almost immediately upon returning to Port Charles. Her gut told her something was deeply wrong, and as she began to peel back the layers of Drew's influence, she found Nina, riddled with guilt, torn between her loyalty to her niece and her fear of exposure. Together, they became a force neither Drew nor the town would see coming. With precision and quiet defiance, they orchestrated a plan not just to disrupt the wedding, but to dismantle the foundation of control Drew had built. Liesl did not just want to rescue Willow. She wanted to dismantle Drew's reality, piece by piece. Their operation was meticulous. A black van with no license plates. Surveillance carefully avoided. A deserted cabin deep in the woods outside Port Charles, sealed off from the world. There, under the veil of night, they took Willow. Drugged just enough to subdue her, but not erase her clarity. When she awoke, it was in near darkness, save for a sliver of moonlight filtered through a barred window. Panic surged in her chest as she reached to rub the ache in her neck. Her memories of the previous night were hazy, as if scrubbed away by a dream, until the door creaked open and Liesl entered, her face both fierce and maternal. Behind her was Nina, holding a wooden box filled with sealed folders, thumb drives, and photographs. Evidence that would shatter the illusion of safety Drew had built around Willow. Willow sat in silence as they laid out the truth. The footage from a hidden camera showing Drew slipping something into her drink. The recorded phone calls between Drew and a woman named Jacinda, in which they spoke of cooperative compliance and cognitive easing. Bank transfers. Legal documents. A forged medical report. With every piece of proof, Willow's expression changed, confusion, horror, betrayal. She had not been loved, she had been possessed. And now, that possession was about to culminate in a ceremony where she would unknowingly surrender what little autonomy she had left. Until tonight. Meanwhile, at the church, the air grew thick with unease. Guests whispered about the bride's absence. The music faltered, restarted, faltered again. Drew eventually arrived, disheveled, a thin bruise darkening beneath the sleeve of his jacket. He smiled, forcing calm, offering a vague excuse about a migraine. But Curtis Ashford's eyes narrowed immediately. Portia Robinson, standing a few feet away, exchanged a look with him. She had already uncovered the offshore accounts linked to Drew's shell corporations. A medical facility in the Bahamas, a trust fund named after Willow without her signature. Something far more sinister than simple deception. Curtis had been waiting for this day, to strike when Drew was most exposed. And now, he had backup. From the choir loft, Scout Kane watched the crowd with wide, uneasy eyes. She clutched the torn piece of veil she'd hidden in her jacket, the same one she had found in Willow's room earlier that morning. No one had listened when she said Willow was missing. No one believed her when she said something terrible was happening. And now, dressed in white satin and soft pink bows, Scout sat alone, the weight of truth too heavy for her small frame to carry. She knew Drew wasn't the hero he claimed to be. Willow had been her only real connection after her mother's death. Losing her now felt like losing the last piece of herself. Far from the church, Liesl and Nina executed the final phase of their plan. They sent a video directly to Sonny Corinthos, still consumed with securing the docks and suppressing Marco Rios's reappearance. The video showed Drew in a secret meeting with Marco, discussing the falsification of Willow's psychological profile to ensure legal guardianship if she became non-compliant. Sonny, furious and betrayed, saw clearly what he had ignored for too long. The man he had once trusted with sensitive intel had become a threat to his own family. And just as Sonny was absorbing the gravity of what he'd seen, Jason Morgan arrived. Recently returned from Paris, where he had glimpsed a woman hauntingly similar to Britt Westbourne, Jason was already on edge. When he saw the footage, any trace of doubt vanished. Drew had crossed a line. And now, he had to be stopped. At the altar, Drew's carefully composed mask began to crack as he realized something had gone horribly wrong. The priest hesitated, waiting for the bride. A murmur ran through the guests. Then, the lights dimmed slightly, and a screen behind the altar came to life. Willow's face filled the screen, not terrified, not drugged, but clear-eyed and strong. She spoke slowly, her voice unwavering as she laid bare the months of gaslighting, the false affection, the chemical manipulation, and the emotional imprisonment. She said she could no longer allow herself to be silent. That love was not something taken by force or rebuilt with lies. That the man standing at the altar was not her savior, but her captor. Drew's expression turned to stone as the room erupted in gasps, some crying out in horror, others sitting in stunned silence. The guests stood motionless, witnesses to a truth no one had anticipated. Portia stepped forward with an envelope of legal documentation and handed it to the arriving officers. Drew tried to leave, but Curtis blocked his path. The badge gleamed beneath Curtis's coat. Scout, no longer silent, stepped down from the loft and crossed the aisle, her tiny fingers gripping the torn veil like a relic of war. Drew was arrested, not with a fight, but in eerie silence. His world, so carefully constructed, so deeply manipulative, crumbled in front of the very people he had deceived. Willow, freed from the prison of illusions, returned to Port Charles as something new, not a broken victim, but a survivor reclaimed by those who truly saw her worth. Liesl and Nina didn't just rescue Willow from Drew. They rescued her from a future she never chose. And as Jason and Sonny prepared for the next reckoning ahead, one thing became clear: Port Charles would never be the same again. Willow, isolated in the quiet, dim room where she had been held not by captors, but by liberators, found herself navigating a storm of revelations more jarring than any imprisonment. Her thoughts churned with a disorienting blend of disbelief, grief, and recognition. All her life, she had been taught to see enemies and allies in stark contrast, white and black, good and evil. And yet now, in this moment of fragile clarity, everything she believed had been inverted. Liesl Albrecht, whom she had once feared and resented, stood before her not as a villain, but as the only person willing to give her the truth she had been too afraid to seek. The same woman whose rage once struck fear into the hospital halls now radiated a strange, protective calm. Her eyes burned with indignation for what Willow had endured, but not once did she try to coerce Willow or lead her down a prescribed path. Liesel gave her only the truth, delivered with unflinching honesty, and the power to choose what came next. Willow sat in silence, the weight of her shattered illusions pressing on her chest like a vice. In her trembling hands was a creased flyer, one she had been too emotional to throw away. A printed announcement of her wedding, complete with a glossy photograph of her and Drew smiling beneath golden sunlight. She stared at the image, numb. That smile, her smile, had been real. In that moment, she had believed in it. Believed in love as the one thread of meaning still left after loss had hollowed out everything else. But now she saw it differently. The warmth in Drew's eyes in that photo wasn't devotion, it was possession. Every kind gesture, every whispered promise, every look of concern had been carefully calibrated. Her reality had been distorted, not by force, but by something far more insidious, manipulation masked as protection, dependency masked as love. What she once believed was sanctuary was in fact a cage, built so gradually, so skillfully, that she hadn't realized she was already locked inside until Liesel shattered the illusion. As Willow pieced herself back together emotionally, another scene unfolded miles away in the grand cathedral where she was meant to say, "I do." The air was electric with anticipation but laced with unease. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats as the wedding march played for a second time with still no sign of the bride. The flowers were perfect, the candles flickered in synchronized beauty, but the absence of Willow cast a growing shadow over the ceremony. Drew stood at the altar, alone and stiff, cloaked in expensive fabric and false calm. His smile no longer reached his eyes, his breath slightly too shallow. Around him, whispers spread like wildfire. Had something gone wrong? Was the bride merely delayed or had she run away? The uncertainty was abruptly punctured when the overhead lights dimmed and a screen, originally meant to display a soft montage of romantic photos, instead flickered to life with a different message entirely. There was no music. No warning. Just the stark clarity of a handheld camera, revealing Willow seated on a modest wooden chair in the dim shelter of the cabin where she had found her freedom. She looked directly into the lens. There was no trace of tears, no signs of confusion, only clarity. Her voice, though low, was steady and unwavering. She spoke not with vengeance but with purpose. In the video, Willow described how she had spent months under Drew's psychological control. How he had slowly, methodically taken over her decisions under the guise of love and healing. She spoke of the vitamins laced with sedatives, of being isolated from those who truly cared for her, of the emotional strings Drew pulled with expert cruelty. She didn't scream. She didn't rage. Instead, she told the truth as it was, raw and simple, exposing the rot at the foundation of their relationship. This wedding, she said, was meant to celebrate a lie. And I will not pledge myself to a lie, no matter how carefully it has been dressed in lace and candlelight. Gasps filled the church. Some guests clutched their mouths. Others stared in frozen horror. The illusion that Drew had so meticulously curated, of the devoted partner, the honorable man, the victim of past wrongs, cracked audibly in the hush that followed Willow's final words. At the front, Drew stood paralyzed, color draining from his face as the enormity of what was unfolding closed in on him. The silence that followed the end of the video was deafening. Scout, sitting near the back, began to sob quietly, overwhelmed not by confusion but by vindication. She had known something was wrong, but no one had believed her. She had seen the signs, felt the shift in Willow's warmth, but her voice had been too small in a world that dismissed children's warnings. Now, as the truth played out for everyone to see, her tears were not just grief, but relief. In that sacred space, where vows were meant to bind two souls, the very concept of commitment had been burned to ash. Behind the last pews, cloaked in the shadows cast by stained glass light, Nina gripped Liesel's hand tightly. Her knuckles were white, her breath held, but her eyes were locked on the altar. For all the pain she had caused in the past, this was her redemption. She had stood by and allowed too many lies to persist, but this time, she had helped save someone. And beside her, Liesel stood tall, not gloating, not smug, simply resolute. They hadn't merely stopped a wedding. They had dismantled a fantasy built on control. They had given Willow back to herself. The events of that day would echo through Port Charles for months, maybe years. The sanctity of Drew's image was gone, his reputation now bloodied by truth. What he had built on manipulation had crumbled with the words of a woman he could no longer control. But more importantly, a life had been spared from a fate disguised as love. Willow was free, not just from Drew, but from the need to rationalize the abuse she had endured. She had faced her captor not with vengeance, but with truth. And in doing so, she became her own salvation. As the final moment unfolded beneath the vaulted arches of the cathedral, the sound of polished shoes against marble floor reverberated through the stunned silence like the ticking of a long-silenced clock. Officers moved in with deliberate, grave purpose, parting the guests like a tide, the gleam of their badges refracting through the candlelit air. Curtis Ashford led them, his figure tall and unwavering, his every step echoing the power of a reckoning long in the making. The weight of truth clung to his shoulders like armor, not heavy, but necessary. In his hand, the arrest warrant for Drew Kane, signed, sealed, irrefutable, was the culmination of weeks spent stitching together a tapestry of deceit, each thread of evidence pulled from the seams of a life too perfectly tailored. Curtis's eyes locked on Drew as he approached the altar, not with animosity, but with finality. There was no gloating in his expression, only the steady, silent assertion of justice. Drew, by contrast, stood frozen in disbelief, as if the very cathedral walls had turned on him. Just moments earlier, he had stood in this exact spot expecting admiration, expecting applause. He had rehearsed every word of his vows, every calculated expression, believing he had orchestrated the perfect performance. But all of that was ashes now, swept away in the blaze of Willow's recorded confession and the slow, deliberate unveiling of his darkest intentions. His eyes darted across the room, seeking some anchor, some familiar face that might offer support. But all he met were stunned gazes, heads turned away, or worse, eyes wide with realization. The people who had once toasted him, who had believed in the narrative he so carefully constructed, now saw him for what he was. There was nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide. And when Curtis finally stood before him and spoke the words that would end his illusion of control, "Drew Kane, you are under arrest." There was no resistance. Drew's hands twitched once, subtly, as if considering flight, but they quickly fell to his sides. His composure shattered. The handcuffs clicked into place, the cold metal biting into his wrists like the physical manifestation of the truth he had long evaded. As he was turned away from the altar, the symbolic center of his supposed love and devotion, the wedding guests watched in a stunned silence that no one dared break. Portia, standing to the side with a folder of corroborating evidence in her arms, felt no joy in the moment, only the grim satisfaction of seeing accountability enforced. Among the crowd, eyes wide and tear-filled, Scout Kane watched her father being taken away. For so long, the adults around her had dismissed her unease. Her quiet observations. The subtle changes in Willow. She had tried to say something, tried to tell someone, but no one had listened. And now, seeing it all unravel. Seeing her instincts vindicated, she felt the heavy, complex ache of a child forced to grow up too quickly. Her sobs were soft but deeply felt, and nearby, an elderly woman gently placed a hand on her shoulder, offering what little comfort she could. The cathedral had been decorated with meticulous elegance. Every floral arrangement, every ribbon, every candle had been chosen to convey love, commitment, and unity. And now, that beauty sat in eerie contrast to the raw devastation that filled the room. The petals on the floor were no longer symbols of celebration, they looked like the remnants of something once sacred, now ruined. The faint scent of lavender, once calming, now clung bitterly in the air like perfume on a crime scene. And far away, in the solitude of the cabin's modest walls, Willow stood behind a sheer curtain that rippled gently in the summer breeze. She had watched the entire arrest via live feed. Her heart pounded in her chest not from fear, but from the staggering weight of the moment. It was over. The performance, the lies, the unspoken fears, done. In place of them, silence. Peace. Her breath caught in her throat, not because she was unsure, but because for the first time in months, she had the space to feel something real. And then, as if reclaiming her right to her own existence, she exhaled. Her tears fell freely now. Not out of sorrow, but release. Liesel and Nina remained quiet beside her, offering presence without pressure. Liesel's face bore the intensity of a general who had just won a battle, while Nina's features were softer, tinged with maternal grief and quiet pride. They had risked everything to save Willow, not just from Drew's grip, but from the narrative she had been forced to accept as her reality. Liesel had delivered more than truth, she had returned Willow to herself. Willow turned to face them. Her eyes, red and glassy, still shimmered with pain, but there was no tremor in her voice. "Thank you," she said softly. Not because she had been rescued like some helpless damsel, but because she had been given the tools, the knowledge, and the space to rescue herself. The video she recorded hadn't been easy to make. Her voice had broken 3 times. But each word had been her own. Each sentence carved from her will to survive, to reject the life Drew had crafted for her like a puppet master. She had broken her own chains. She stepped outside the cabin for the first time since her abduction, and the sun greeted her like an old friend. It had been raining in Port Charles earlier that day, but now the sky was clear, wide, and blue. A symbol, perhaps, of what came next. The ground beneath her feet was firm, and she took her steps with purpose. Not fast. Not hesitant. Just steady. She no longer feared being watched, no longer dreaded the next demand or manipulation. Each step forward was a quiet rebellion against every moment she had doubted her own instincts.